Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Are you ready to start?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Well, welcome. My name is Doris Martel. I'm from CARE. I'm one of the co-chairs of the IGWG Gender-Based Violence Working Group, and I'm here with my colleagues and co-chairs Charlotte Hellman-Jacobs from PRB. Thanks for hosting us today, Charlotte. Michal Adni and Afifa Abdul Rahman. Welcome. And we are here today to finish up a series that we've been having this year focused on gender-based violence in the context of life course, particularly focusing on children, adolescents, and youth. So we have quite a few people in the room, and we have quite a few people online streaming via internet. So I just want to say welcome to everybody. For the people who are online, we have you muted for the time being to optimize the sound quality. So just want to check and make sure you can hear us. Can people on the phone hear us? You can type into the chat box and tell us whether the sound quality is okay. And please, when you listen to the presentations, you can type your questions or your comments into the chat box, and we'll read those out when we get to the Q&A session. Nobody's saying they can or can't hear us, so let's assume that they can. So in this series, we focused on the global data of the manifestations of gender-based violence among children and youth, and in life stages up to adulthood, and what the linkages are between those. We've done some deep dives into promising interventions, and we've also done kind of a little bit of a lit review looking at some data from multiple countries. And we know from the studies, from the images data, that there's really compelling evidence of the linkages between violence experienced or witnessed in childhood and what their experiences are of perpetration or experiencing of violence as adults. So this has really piqued our interest in what interventions or what research or what data are available for working with children, adolescents, and youth on violence prevention and the linkages between those interventions and later life course health or wellness. So we've had some really good presentations in this series, and the first one was an overview with Dr. Susan Hillis from the CDC and Dr. Rebecca Lundgren from IRH, and they introduced us to the prevalence of the data of childhood violence and the impact on reproductive health later in life, and some evidence from promising approaches. Those presentations and the recordings are available on the IGWG website, so I'd encourage you, if you weren't here, to go and look at those. That was a great session. We later focused on early childhood interventions. We had the privilege of listening to Dr. Mark Tomlinson from Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He did a fantastic job reviewing the data and the evidence from early childhood parenting interventions, and as well as presenting some data from a current intervention in South Africa, which I won't get the pronunciation well enough, probably, Sekula Ngwadlione. And we also heard from Dr. Kim Ashburn from Georgetown looking at the real man interventions in Uganda. We've also had some presentations about later adolescence. So we had Dr. Stacy Gage presenting from Tulane University on an intervention looking at dating violence later on. So we've done quite a review of the data and the evidence and the interventions across the life cycle. And today we have the privilege of looking at the middle stages of kind of the middle school years around ages 10 to 14. So we're really privileged to have Dr. Ravi Verma speaking with us today. And he'll be speaking on multi-country intervention data coming from the GEMS, Gender Equity Movement in Schools. He is based in New Delhi and will be speaking virtually, so cross your fingers for the technology to work. Dr. Ravi Verma is the Regional Director at the International Center for Research on Women in the Asia Regional Office. And he has worked on reproductive health, gender-based violence, working with violence against women, working with young boys and masculinities. He has such a plethora of experience as a researcher and as an implementer. I feel really privileged that we have him available to speak with us today. And second, we'll hear from Julie Hanson Swanson, who's the Acting Education Chief in the Africa Bureau. She's with us in person today. And she's spent many years also looking at the intersection of gender education and reproductive health. And she'll be speaking from the experiences of working on the with the Global Working Group to End School-Related Gender-Based Violence and some measures for those middle school years about how to measure results in those school-based interventions. So I feel really lucky that you're here with us today. So we're going to hear from Ravi first, and then we'll take about 20 minutes for questions for clarification from Ravi.
We'll just do short clarification at that point.
Short clarifying questions, full kind of general comments or questions for the end. And then we'll hear from Julie, and we'll take a short pause for clarifying questions. Then we'll turn it over to all of you for comments and lively discussion. So welcome, and I will turn it over to Ravi with my fingers crossed for the technology.
Hi, Doris. Good morning. Good everyone. This is Ravi Verma from Delhi International Center for Research on Women, and I'm here with my colleague Pranita and Nandita Batla. We as a team have worked on the project for many years. Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Not so well.
Yes.
Ravi, can you get closer to the mic?
If you can speak closer to the mic, Ravi, that would be helpful.
All right. Is that okay?
That's better.
Okay. So what we are presenting today is the experience of implementing gender equity movement in school program in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Jharkhand, one of the states in India. We have the initial round of data from Jharkhand and Da Nang province of Vietnam, and that we would like to share today. We have titled it as Transcending Cultural Boundaries, Evidence and Learning from GEMS. In this presentation, we would very briefly touch upon the program approach. What is GEMS? How was that program implemented in these different 3 countries? What was the evaluation design? Some of the key findings that we would like to highlight, but rather focus on the learning, on the challenges of implementing an evaluation of a program in 3 different cultural contexts that we would like to share with the group. So gender equity movement is a program that aims to foster gender equality, redefines masculinity and negates all forms of violence among young adolescents. It draws its theoretical perspective from addressing the gender in a holistic framework of trying to address the issue of power, how it gets defined at a very early stages in life, how children, both boys and girls, come to accept the entitlement to the boys and a subordinate role for girls. There are 4 pillars of this program. We began working with very young age group, which is 10 to 14 as Doris said. We work within the institutions, that is within the institutions of education, that is school. We engage with both boys and girls in the program, and we use various gender transformative approaches and techniques while intervening with the boys and girls. In fact, it has, over the last 10 years, the GEMS have been implemented in many different states in India, starting with Maharashtra and Mumbai to Goa and then Bihar and later in Bangladesh, Vietnam and Jharkhand. And this is what I'm. So how are these countries different or similar that define the larger backdrop within which the program was implemented? All these 3 countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Nepal, Vietnam, Bangladesh and India, have very strong patriarchal norms. You know, the data suggests that there is very strong son preference that exists that prevail in all these 3 countries. There is very high level of the interpersonal violence, and and the rapidly declining sex ratios in some of these countries. In terms of education, there is a similarity where at the primary level we don't see much of a gender disparity. Boys and girls enroll almost equal numbers, but as soon as they cross the primary level, we see a sharp a difference in how girls uptake the secondary and beyond levels of education in Bangladesh and India. There is a massive decline in the rate of secondary school enrollment for the girls in Bangladesh and India compared to Vietnam. And all these three countries present very different economic, political, religious systems, with Bangladesh and India with lower and mid-income bracket, whereas Vietnam on the middle income and with very different kind of political institutions that govern these three countries. But what is critical is to see how schools and the pedagogy that defines the teaching learning process in these countries, and with that is important for us to remember when we started implementing the program, GEMS program. First of all, the infrastructure is very different in these three countries. The Vietnam is much better endowed with respect to the school infrastructure, the classrooms and other facilities compared to Bangladesh and Jharkhand where we worked. The school size and classroom sizes are also very different. Vietnam is usually large, has schools with large size, and the classroom size is also on an average about 40, whereas in Jharkhand and Bangladesh, it is the schools are very small, but then the classroom sizes are very big. In fact, even in a small school, we see the classrooms having about 80 to 90 children stuffed in one room. In terms of the age group, the Vietnam had much younger age group in the 6th, 7th, and 8th standard where we intervened, whereas in Jharkhand and Bangladesh, the age range was much bigger. Because of many reasons, these children continue to stay on in the same class for a little longer. So we have 11 to 15 years and 16 years of kids in the same class, whereas in Dana we had 11 to 13 years that comprise the classroom, so much younger. In all the three sites, the pedagogy is similar, which is they embody the aspects of patriarchy in terms of how teaching is imparted and how questioning on the part of students of children is largely discouraged. And have banned corporal punishment, but then physical punishment remains the dominant method of disciplining the children, and that's important to know, because there's an acceptance of structural forms of violence, in fact, in the lives of the children. So when we implement this GEMS program, we initially wanted to see whether the GEMS that was initially tested in India would be applicable in Bangladesh and Vietnam, and that was done through an extended and very intensive phase of formative research. And what formative research really informed us was that the core ideas of the GEMS were retained as they were. The issues around gender and violence, relationship, entitlement, they remained, they were seen applicable in all the three contexts as they were. But then the activities and the stories were to be made, were adapted in terms of making them context specific. There were some sessions that were added in Vietnam that were not there. In Bangladesh, for example, we added a session on child marriage in Bangladesh, and in Vietnam we added a session on man masculinity and what is a real man. And we used a lot of local opportunities to strengthen the program in these three countries. For example, in Dana we used web-based, that a game was developed as an implementer, as a part of the GEMS program. Road shows were organized. In Bangladesh, we use the Madrasas as a site for intervention, which is very interesting. And then in India, Jharkhand, we engaged with the platforms that were provided by the school in terms of the school management committees that engages with the parents, and also the children's platform, which they call Bal Sansad, is a parliament, children's parliament operating within the school system. So these were the local opportunities that gave us levers to implement the program in a context-specific manner. So we work with the schools, and working with the schools, that we brought teachers as a critical constituency of the program on board. We work with the teachers and other staff of the schools to build their capacities. We did work with the teachers and other staff in a phased out manner to orient them, reorient them, and then we make sure that their programs are monitored on a regular basis through the parent-teachers meeting and other means of school visits and things like that. So there was an intensive engagement with the school as a system in terms of policies, impacting their policies also. And then we work with the school children, 6 to 7 years. Group education activities were done with boys and girls over 2 academic years, and we covered the domains like gender, violence, body changes, emotions, relationships, and communications. And they were all conducted with girls and boys together, except on body changes session that were done separately with Jharkhand. And then we use techniques of gender transformative approaches. That means all the sessions were designed to ask questions, to present the role, use the role plays. Going, we went beyond giving information and engaged students and children to talk about their personal lives and reflect on the personal lives in the light of what was being discussed in the session. So we created a kind of dissonance as a method of approach for critical thinking, and personal examples were drawn. So this slide tells you that we had some of the elements of the implementation in terms of the campaign. We used GEMS diary, which provided a link between the children and the parents and the school, where the discussions were taken to home, both in Jharkhand and Danang. And there's an example here, web-based game that Danang developed, and there were other. The pledging was done as a method of ensuring that everyone is on the same page with respect to gender equality. So it's kind of creating enabling environment and taking the conversation beyond the schools to the boundaries of the home and communities. The evaluation design was in Danang, so I'm presenting only, we are presenting the findings from these two, Danang and Jharkhand. In Danang it was implemented, we did 20 schools, school was used as a cluster, so 10 intervention and comparison. In Jharkhand it was implemented in 80 schools, 40 in intervention and 40 comparison. The 2 rounds of data were collected in Danang, baseline and end line. They were cross-section data, whereas in Jharkhand we have data which is a longitudinal panel, and there were 3 rounds of data, baseline, midline, and end line. And then the total number of students that were interviewed as part of the baseline and end line in Jharkhand were 400 from each intervention and comparison, whereas 3,000 students participated in 3 rounds of the interviews there were slightly different ways of collecting data. In Danang we use self-administered pen paper technique, whereas in Jharkhand we use the audio computer assisted self-administered interviewing technique, which is a kind of a tablet was used to gather the information. And then we also had the series of qualitative data coming in the form of ideas and FGDs in both the places, for 3 rounds in Jharkhand and 1 round in Danang. So as expected, what we found, the age bracket was much larger in Jharkhand than in Danang. In Danang, about 90% of the children were between 11 to 12 years in the during the surveys, whereas it was almost 33% were beyond 12 years in the Jharkhand. So little older age group in the Jharkhand. Parent education, in Vietnam we had higher mothers education. Fathers were also better educated than their counterparts in Jharkhand. The children from Vietnam had slightly better off in terms of their access to TV and access to cell phones and internet. But then witnessing parental violence was almost similar in both these settings. Almost 40% of children had witnessed violence at home. And so as a result of all this, when we undertook this further analysis, we controlled for some of these background variables or drivers that we thought theoretically driven and also from the literature that impact the outcome. So year of birth, sex, perceived economic status, father's education, mother's education, access to some of these gadgets, and witnessing parental violence were controlled while seeing the impact of the program on some of the outcomes. Now, the result we found that both in Ghana and Vietnam and Jharkhand, there has been a shift towards the positive shift in the attitude of students. So look at the left-hand side of the graph, this is Da Nang. There is, in the intervention schools from baseline to end line, there is a move from 9 to 32%. That's 9% who were during the baseline more gender equitable in their attitudes. That segment has increased to 32%. And a large number of them have come from the moderate category. So what this graph has is that portion on the below is the least equitable children. The middle one is the moderate or medium equitable, and the upper one is the highly equitable. So the shift we see is from the moderately equitable boys and girls who shifted to the most equitable ones in Ghana. Whereas in Jharkhand, the similar shift happened from very low 2% during baseline to moving to a higher level of 14%. But what's important here is 16%. But what is important here is that most of the shift happened from the least equitable to this category. So we see a kind of a dent that was made in among the children who belong to the least equitable category during the baseline. But that's one point. But overall, it seems that there has been a shift in the desirable direction in terms of their attitude. And here are some specific examples of statements on norms related to gender and violence. For example, in Vietnam, a much larger proportion of children disagreed during the end line that it is for women to take care of children at home. A significant proportion of children at the end line in Vietnam disagreed with the statement that girls are tolerant than boys by nature. Similarly, in Jharkhand, a much greater proportion, a significantly higher proportion of children disagreed with the statement that women's primary responsibility is to take care of children at home, and violence against women is acceptable in some situations. There were almost 34% who had said in Jharkhand that violence against women is acceptable in some situations. That has increased to 51%. Disagree. So it's kind of a massive impact in terms of some of the attitudinal statements that we saw. Similarly, on agency and voices, that is, when children felt confident that they could reach out to someone, if they experience violence and they see violence, they would reach out to someone to report this. So in Da Nang, we saw, for example, that proportion of children who said that I would reach out to teacher in case there is an issue or I see a violence increased to almost 67%. And so was the case in case of talking to someone other than teacher about violence, increased to 68% from 50%. So was the case in Jharkhand as well, where they felt much better endowed with the agency to reach out to someone when they see the violence. And I think the one piece that we would like to really highlight is that if you look at the Jharkhand last graph where the girls play with boys sometime or often, at the a larger proportion of them said that they can play with, or they retain almost the same number who said that we continue, girls can play with boys. Whereas in control, we see that proportion has gone down. So a lot of, the gender disaggregation, kind of that happens in terms of play and sitting arrangements. Many of them endorse this, and that idea began to shift in the intervention schools that we saw. Similarly, on perpetration of violence, we see that there's an interesting finding, because between baseline and end line in Vietnam, we have seen that the self-reported perpetration of violence has slightly gone up from 55% to 66% in Vietnam, whereas in Jharkhand, the proportion went up during the midline, but it then declines in the end line. And that's important. We didn't have the midline point in Vietnam. But what it shows is that in the first phase of intervention, after base, it seems there is a much greater recognition of violence, and as a result, more and more children recognize that there's a violence and they report it. But then as the interventions go on, they start reporting as a reduced incidence of violence in the vicinity. But this is an interesting finding, and this is the finding which is in consonance with many other studies that we have seen, where the initial reaction is to report a higher incidence of violence, and later then stabilizing in violence prevention interventions. Baseline to midline in Jharkhand prevalence, there is a small decline in the Jharkhand. Yeah. And then the qualitative findings also tell us that there is an enhanced recognition or articulation of violence, but then there is a struggle to change behavior. Many of the children said that though we recognize, but then we can't change because the expectations are completely against what they want to do. So in different direction. Okay. So what have we learned? And this is what we wanted to highlight a bit. For us, besides the impact of these interventions, it was also important to understand how do you implement this kind of a program in different settings. And we learned many things at different levels. For example, the very first learning that we had was about to get a buy-in within the school system from different authorities in different settings. For example, in Vietnam, given the kind of structure, we have bureaucratic structure, which allowed us to get into the schools and work within the schools much more easily with one letter from the top, and the authorities were on board, and we could work with Vietnam with the partners. Whereas in Jharkhand and Bangladesh, we had the implementation took a lot of delays and a lot of buy-in issues at many different levels. So getting a letter from the top was not just sufficient, but to get the buy-in from this at every school level, principals and teachers was yet another level of exercise that one had to go through. And we think that this is primarily because the mindset of the teachers and the schools in India and Bangladesh, because of deeply entrenched patriarchy, was difficult to negotiate with that space, and most principals and teachers were not willing to get on board with a program like this, which talked about violence and sexuality in some ways, which did not sync with their own ideas. And so was the case with parents. A lot of parents in Jharkhand and Bangladesh had to be convinced to get on board. But there was a lot of learning, and we have documented the process of getting them on board. We also learned how to engage with children in the school system, because none of these three settings allowed children to ask questions in the manner that we think they should be in a participatory learning process. So we had to innovate and improvise the delivery of these modules that would create a lot of role plays or storytelling that children would narrate from their own experiences and then reflect in a group. And therefore, we found that in settings that are not conducive for a participatory learning process or pedagogy is very different, it becomes somewhat of a challenge to implement program like program on violence prevention and gender equality, which in fact assumes some kind of participation and engagement. And that generated a lot of learning for us on how to work on those issues. And then there were structural issues of absenteeism. For example, given very high child labor and the harvesting season when the children in the rural areas had to drop out of the schools for no reasons, or girls starting to drop out for the reasons of preparation for marriage, made it far more challenging for us to continue to keep them in the school, draw them in the schools, and address the issue of absenteeism and make sure that they are exposed to the intervention. And then one of the most critical aspects that we learned was how to connect or link the expectation of children, rising expectations of children from these interventions and the response they needed from the schools in terms of reporting of violence. If the children are reporting violence, then what is the mechanism that is in place to respond to that? And therefore we thought that one of the key learning that was that arose from this experiment was that when we implement violence prevention programs in the schools, we also need to prepare schools to respond to some of the expectations and some of the needs that arise as a result of this program. And so moving forward, we think that there is a very strong reason to move from this kind of a project mode to program mode, and that means ensuring resource pools within the school system at every level. So it's just not about preparing a few facilitators who deliver these modules, but also have to have buy-in from high-level school authorities, from the school management, and from the resource pool that gets created at the school level, both among the teachers and perhaps a combination of teachers, parents, and children, who would continue this discourse on a long-term basis, rather than depending on an external ad hoc kind of input. Because if we are mainstreaming these ideas, this is very important that we begin to think in terms of mainstreaming through creation of these kind of resources. This also raised a very interesting and core aspects of pedagogy of teaching learning process. I think GEMS really reminded everyone who are involved in this program, in the school system, and the parents and children, that the process of teaching and learning has to change. They have to become far more engaging and far more participatory, and that means it is not only about gender and violence that we become participatory, and in the other subjects we become dictating kind of teaching. It has to be an all-pervasive style of teaching and learning, and then only it becomes of greater learning. And this is a perfect, this is how we also learn that when children began to question about violence within the framework of sexuality, the need for a comprehensive sexuality education within the school system, and therefore center staging a discussion on sexuality education within the school system is of utmost importance in these settings, where they can, when the children are taught to say no, they should say no with complete understanding of what it means to say yes. So they need to understand sexual violence not only from a negative perspective, but also from a very positive understanding of their own body and their own self, that allows them to say no in a manner that becomes part of education and becomes part of empowerment rather than a fear response to the violence. And also we learned that moving forward, it will be important to engage with parents and community in order to change the norms, in order to set new norms, in order to provide a support to changing expectations on the part of children and their aspirations. And that cannot happen unless we engage with them on an ongoing basis. And then, as we said, we must establish a continuum of response and prevention continuum in the manner which is viable and which children can resort to if they need help, and therefore the program has to remain not only focused within the schools but connect with all other systems and other response mechanisms that would allow better implementation and better acceptance of changing expectations. So this is where, so thank you very much for listening, and if there are any questions, I am joined by Adita Batla also now, so we will be happy to respond. Thank you.
Ravi, thank you so much. That was amazing. A lot of information in a really short period of time. Looking across sites is really, really interesting. I have a couple of just really basic clarifying questions, and I'm sure people in the room or online do too. Can you clarify, Ravi, how many sessions with the children did the GEMS curriculum have, and over what period of time, and were those offered within the school day or after school? Can you just clarify the methodology?
Ravi, can you hear us?
Can you hear us, Ravi? This would be a bad moment to lose the connection.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Sorry. So thank you, Doris. In fact, it was muted from my side. Thank you. There were 27 sessions, and these 27 sessions were implemented over 2 academic years in the 6th standard and the 7th standard. And all these sessions were implemented during the regular delivery of the course curriculum that were part of the teaching. So all the schools who agreed to implement GEMS program had also agreed to implement GEMS curriculum as part of their regular teaching in the school timing. So none of the sessions were implemented outside the school timing. They were all implemented during the school timing, and they were implemented by, in some places, the teachers. Mostly teachers, were supported by sometimes some facilitators from our NGO partners.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to take questions in the room first, then we'll take some of the questions in the chat box. So Nicole has the mic, and I'm just going to ask people to share their name and where they're from, and then their question.
Hi, this is Peter Goldstein from PRB. I had a question regarding some of the tools that you mentioned you were using to engage the youth. For example, the web-based game and others. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on the relative impact of those various tools. What the youth tended to respond to. What seemed to be most effective.
Thank you. The one that we found extremely useful in all the setting, and although Bangladesh we have not presented here, but is currently under implementation. GEMS Diary was the one tool which was extremely popular and was used extensively by both students and teachers on one hand and the parents on the other. GEMS Diary was a tool that comprises of a lot of exercises that help children to question the existing gender norms and provide their own reflections as to whether it is what they think about this, and not only do that reflections alone, but also in conjunction with their parents and siblings within the family. So as a result, the discourse that happened within the school system, within the schools during the GEMS curriculum delivery of that module, the similar discussion happened within the family when they took the GEMS Diary back home and did those exercises with the parents. So, and that was very interesting element of the GEMS program, because that not only provided a kind of bridge between what happened in the schools and in the family, but also validated a lot of ideas that we were trying to raise or trying to situate in the lives of the children and in the families. So that was one, and we very strongly believe that GEMS Diary is a tool that can be used in many different ways by many stakeholders to engage together on using that platform. Web-based was used in Da Nang, Vietnam, and that very extensively, and the teachers monitored the responses and the question answer sessions using web-based tool on these discussions. But also they used the same GEMS Diaries Vietnamese version in Vietnam that was used by the children in Vietnam. So that was, but from our side, I think GEMS Diary was one which really provided a lot of cross-cultural similarities in the youth and the acceptance. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you very much. I'm going to anticipate a question and just ask Ravi if you have made that curriculum material and the diary material as well as maybe the web-based material available. Is that available for download online?
Yes, sure. Yes. That's on our website as well, but I'll send you, Doris, the links.
Thank you very much. So check the website, ICRW. All right, any other questions in the room? Lots of questions. Let's take two then, since we have a lot.
Okay. Hi, Ravi. My name is Afifa Abdurrahman. I'm working at USAID in the Population and Reproductive Health Office. I had a question about the curriculum, and I'm fascinated as to know how you incorporated into the school curriculum. Like, was it part of what part of the school day was it incorporated into? And because it seems like it would be very difficult with all the other subjects, and maybe I missed this in the beginning, but like I would be interested to know how you incorporated it and how schools were brought on board to actually want this to be part of their curriculum. I have another question, but I'll let that go for later.
Thank you, Afifa. And let's take a second question just to clarify.
Okay.
Let's ask clarifying questions, and general discussion will come back.
Hi, this is Alyssa Cochran from Winrock International. You kind of discussed how you had a challenge in getting the buy-in from the teachers and also parents into supporting this program. Could you elaborate a little bit more of what were the actual methods you used to help increase their engagement to actually move forward with the implementation of the project?
Right. Thank you. Can I take these two questions and then take other questions later? Is that okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right. I would also request my colleagues here, Pranita and Nandita, to help me respond to some of these questions. Let me take a first shot. The first of all, these GEMS curriculum were not integrated into the school curriculum in the manner that they were not examined. Students were not examined on those content, and nor they were delivered as part of regular curriculum of the schools. Schools agreed to incorporate the delivery of these curriculums modules as part of the school timing. So they allocated from the regular let's say 7 hours of teaching in the day, 1 hour for the delivery of GEMS curriculum. So it was not part of any other subject. It did not become part of any other curriculum, but it was standalone, but delivered as part of the regular teaching program. And as a result, most students saw this as part of the school program rather than anything additional coming out of the school program. And this was very important, because very important for the children and the parents and also teachers to know that there is a much higher buy-in to the idea of gender equality through delivery of these modules as part of the regular teaching program. Now, and I'm repeating that there was no examination done, there was no usual monitoring of these delivery of these curriculum that it would be done in case of other subjects. So that's one. Why did the school agree to accept this this model of? We thought that we were convinced from all other programs that any extracurricular program, it will not be as effective as something which becomes part of the regular timetable. There has to be a time allocated and should be implemented as part of the regular timetable. Then only teachers and students become committed to that program in the given situation of our teaching. And therefore there is, okay, but in the first place when we went to the school authorities, showed them school-based violence, they were prepared to do this. They agreed to do the program because it seems there is general acceptance to the whole idea that yes, there is some amount of, there's a whole lot of frustration, children are not controllable. The perception about violence in the school is there among the authorities and teachers.
And both in all these three sides also, as Ravi shared, that corporal punishment is banned, but we all know it's very much there. So the program also got a policy backing. So like, even in Jharkhand, with the Education for All Act in place, which clearly talks about, like, how to make school free from violence, or a place where children come without any fear. So that actually the way we presented the whole program was also within that context, that how it can actually help in achieving some of the policy guidelines and legislative guidelines. So that really helped enable, yeah, in all the three sides actually. Yeah. In fact, I mean, though this is not the question, but the thing is that in Bangladesh, government of Bangladesh got involved so much in this program that, it actually delayed. But of course, there is this whole, like, they are involved in each step of the program implementation, from, like, yeah, including research, to adaptation, to implementation and training of teachers. So they very much, and they really see the value of the program within the existing policies that each of the countries have.
Yes. So this is a perfect segue into the second question, that despite having this kind of a high-level policy support, which allowed us to integrate this program into the regular school teaching program, there was resistance from the teachers. Teachers were not equipped to address the sensitive issues of relationship violence and sexuality in the manner the GEMS was talking about, the manner in which we have addressed. And their own, bottlenecks, their own issues around these issues. So there were resistance from the teachers, and that's where we had series of orientation sessions. We had discussions with the teachers, and teachers both at the higher level. We invited them at the district level and did 2 to 3 days of couple of workshops with them on the issues of gender and violence, to get them on board, to make them see the point. And when they went back to the schools, they were charged and they wanted to talk about this. So many of these teachers themselves became the spokesperson for this program. And once a few teachers came on board, it became a kind of snowballing. So one teacher became the spokesperson for other teachers. So we were there in a very organic manner implementing this program in the schools.
Yeah, and the thing to add, I think, is that when the teachers went back and they were like, wanting to do this in the schools, they were also.
Can you sit just really close to the mic? We can't hear you.
Okay. Okay. So I just want to say that these teachers who were kind of, becoming committed to the idea and wanting to take this into their own schools, were also meetings that happened in each one of the schools, where the principals and the teachers were part of an orientation meeting where, why this issue is important to address, what will be done about it. So it was really creating ownership and conviction at different levels through a series of activities.
Nicole.
I think I heard you say that it's very important for the process of both principals and teachers at the school level to be part of that orientation process for ownership and buy-in. So I think at this point we should probably hold on the clarifying questions and move to the next presentation. But further discussion is clearly welcome and needed, and we're going to have lots of interesting debate and discussion on this. So hold. I'm going to ask if the team in New Delhi could just stay on the line for the discussion and the further questions. Thank you so much for staying up late for us. And we'll turn next to Julie Hanson Swanson.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning and good evening to everyone. Okay, so in my presentation, I will describe the OASIS program, which is opportunities for achievement and safety in schools. I'll also present a framework to measure school-related gender-based violence and also provide an update on the work of the Global Working Group to End School-Related Gender-Based Violence. So what is school-related gender-based violence? I think probably, how many of you are familiar with this exact term, this term of art? Okay, great. So it is gender-based violence as we know it, but in a school setting. And school-related gender-based violence does take into account both the experiences of girls and boys as both perpetrators and victims. So what are the forms of SRGBV? I think one way we've always conceptualized gender-based violence is being physical, psychological, and sexual, which I think is a good framework for talking about GBV in general. However, from a measurement point of view, there is overlap of the types. For example, bullying can manifest itself in both physical and psychological ways. The same with corporal punishment. It is physical, but teachers also use verbal forms of humiliating students to punish them. So the measurement framework that we use in SRGBV is looking at bullying, sexual violence, and corporal punishment. Because what we have tried to do is to make these categories as mutually exclusive as possible, since that is what we strive for from a measurement perspective. So OASIS. OASIS is a program out of the Africa Bureau, the Education Division of the Africa Bureau. It was launched in May 2014. It's interesting because it's not a project per se. It is a program that we're using different projects, different types of funding, but to reach these 4 objectives. And the first objective is to generate data that contribute to understanding causes, incidents, and effects of SRGBV. Secondly, we want to strengthen USAID and other stakeholder capacity to measure and monitor SRGBV. We are working to improve stakeholder coordination, and finally to increase awareness of SRGBV among USAID and non-USAID stakeholders. So to date, this is what we've accomplished in terms of generating data. Working in partnership with RTI through a task order called DERP, which I can't remember what that stands for, but I think it has, I'm looking at you, Janae. And research program? Yes, which goes to show you we shouldn't have too many acronyms. But under that task order with RTI, RTI
drafted a report, a literature review on the intersection of safe learning environments and educational achievement. That was a foundational report because we wanted to know, what do we know? And what the report indicated was that clearly, intuitively, we feel that there's a relationship between having a safe learning environment and student achievement. And the data that existed shows that there were relationships, but there is no empirical data to show that there's a causal relationship. And maybe I should back up as to why it's important to make this connection. I think, well, is it obvious what the connection is? It is? Okay, good. Because clearly from an advocacy point of view, USAID invests hundreds of millions of dollars in early grade reading programs. And at this point, the focus has been more on pedagogy. However, those of us in the room, we know that gender-based violence has a huge impact on children in terms of their health and well-being, but also in terms of their ability to succeed in education. So by generating data that shows that there's a relationship, that gives us the power to convince stakeholders in the global community, in AID, that we really do need to pay attention to the learning environment. Okay. So one piece of analysis we had commissioned with RTI was done by Louise Crouch. He's an economist. And we also thought this was an important piece of information to have to be better advocates for making the case for greater investments in SRGBV reduction. So what Louise's analysis found is that SRGBV can be associated with the loss of one primary grade of schooling, which translates to a yearly cost of around $17 billion to low and middle income countries. Now, and this is a figure that is more than what is spent on overseas assistance grants for education interventions. So this is an important piece of data. It was derived from looking at data from several global periodic surveys done in the field of education. They are Trends in Mathematics and Science Studies, TIMSS, Progress in Reading and Literacy Study, PEARLS, and the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA. These are the DHSs for us in the education field, and they are surveys which need to be mined. And what we've been doing in the Africa Bureau is mining the data from these surveys to show the relationship between SRGBV and achievement. But we do need to point out with this figure, you can only use the data, you can only analyze the data that you have. So the data that we have now from these three global surveys really focuses on bullying, very crude measurements of violence. So when you think about corporal punishment and sexual violence, I think the costs would be much greater than this figure alone. So as we did, we kept mining all of this TIMSS and PEARLS data. So we entered into a partnership with the Center on Conflict and Development at Texas A&M University. And they conducted a secondary analysis of 2011 data from TIMSS and PEARLS in Botswana, Ghana, and South Africa. And what this analysis showed, this deep dive, it showed that bullying was one of the key drivers that lower academic performance. So they looked at different variables as far as teacher experience, parent education, but this was the most important factor that lowered academic performance. And in Botswana, students who experience bullying score lower than those who are not bullied by between 14 and 32 points on these international tests.
These effects are meaningful because at an average score of 400 points, the score differences correspond to a 4% decrease in reading scores to an 8% decrease in science test scores. And once again, this is attributed to bullying as the main factor. In South Africa, students who are bullied score 25 points less than those who are not bullied, corresponding to a 6% decrease in reading scores. And in terms of gender differentials, it was interesting. In Ghana, there really wasn't a difference. I think in one country, girls were more disadvantaged, in another country, boys were more disadvantaged. So there's nothing definitive you can say about the gender differentials, but you can definitively say that children who are bullied are going to do less well on these international tests. So what we've been working on with RTI over the past, I don't know, it seems like a lot more than 2 years, has been a conceptual framework to measure school-related gender-based violence. And actually, that is a picture of the draft. It's in its, well, I was going to say its final throes. That's not the best term. We are almost done. It's almost finished. But one thing that we have decided to do is rename this a conceptual framework for measuring school-related gender-based violence. And the next step will be to develop a very simple how-to toolkit. So implementers can use this. Right now, this is a wonderful, rigorously done piece of work. It's academic, so now we have to adapt it so it's practical. We have the academics and the rigor to show that's important, but now we have to make it usable. So this conceptual framework is based on a literature review that RTI conducted on how school-related gender-based violence was defined and measured. And I would say the majority of the survey questions in the surveys came from existing global surveys. So basically what we wanted to do was to look at the health field, look at those who are working to end corporal punishment, take existing survey items and add them so it's like a one-stop shop. So that is the goal, that the measurement framework consists of survey instruments and also implementation guidance. Let's see. So the type of data that are collected through the different surveys include the nature and extent of the various forms of SRGBV, attitudes and beliefs about gender equality, gender norms, and the power relations that produce and perpetuate SRGBV, and finally, perceptions of life at school or school climate. The survey instruments were developed for students aged 8 to 18, and of course there are different versions depending on the age grouping. And so they were developed for students, teachers, and other school personnel, and also parents and other caregivers at the primary, secondary school level. So it is indeed a comprehensive suite of surveys that when it was piloted, all of these were used because we want people, school-related gender-based violence is such an all-encompassing, it's a very broad phenomenon, and so to capture it, you really do have to look at all the different types. So in the survey for students, it starts off with what we call SRGBV scenarios. They are icebreakers that the interviewer uses because, as we know, working with children is different than working with adults. And working with children on such sensitive topics requires a certain level of sensitivity. So students are asked about experience of SRGBV, perceptions of school climate, survey of attitudes and beliefs, and also basic demographic and socioeconomic wealth module. For the teachers, it's slightly different. They are asked about their experiences of SRGBV, but also there's a survey of their disciplinary practices, also a survey of school climate and of attitudes and beliefs. And finally, for the parents and caregivers, it's limited to 2 modules, one on school climate and the other one on attitudes and beliefs. So this table just demonstrates the breadth and depth of the instrument, that questions are provided both from the perspective of victim and perpetrator, and those are all the different forms of SRGBV that are included. Here are different examples of the scenarios that try to cover all the forms, and they're also different ones according to age and what's age appropriate. So we've been working with the LARA, the Literacy and Retention Activity Project in Uganda. They piloted the instrument in the spring. We have some results coming in, so RTI is incorporating those results into the framework. Then we would like to identify another African country for a second pilot, and as I previously mentioned, the next step is to take this wonderful academic work that RTI has done and translate it into a user-friendly toolkit. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the Global Working Group to End SRGBV. So this group started off with a planning meeting in May 2014 that was convened, it was in Paris, which was nice, and it was convened by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France and the UN Girls Education Initiative. The purpose, and from then we have matured as a working group to help that our division funds a full-time coordinator for the working group. So the 3 goals of the working group are to promote the generation of knowledge, evidence, and standards of response, undertake global and joint advocacy to highlight the issues around SRGBV and its implications for achieving the SDGs, and finally disseminate and make accessible a wide range of tools and resources through an online resource center. So the co-chairs of the group are UNESCO and UNGAI. There are about 30 bilateral, multilateral, and international NGOs that belong to this working group. We are divided into different task teams. Advocacy is led by Plan International, and so what we're focusing on now, like everybody else, is looking at what to do during the 16 days coming up. The research task team is led by USAID. There is a task team working on developing a global guidance document that's being led by UNESCO. And then there's also a subgroup on indicators, which is being led by UNGAI. Because as with, indicators is always that biggest challenge. So here are some achievements of the group since its inception. In 2015, at a UNESCO board meeting, a resolution was passed that defined SRGBV and provided a plan of action for member states. Also, as I mentioned, through the group, we're working with this measurement framework and the development of indicators, and also the global guidance that I mentioned. And the global guidance, it's an overview of all the different facets of SRGBV. So it looks at, similar to GEMS, what can be done at the school level. It looks at policies, reporting systems, monitoring and evaluation, and teacher training, the role of teachers. So it's a comprehensive overview of what we know as best promising practices in the various facets of SRGBV prevention and support a response. So now the work plan for the next year is to support the rollout of the global guidance. I think that's going to be rolled out during the 16 days. Develop and recommend a set of indicators for SRGBV, produce a series of technical briefs, and of course advocate at the regional level and global levels to focus on SRGBV and advocate that more resources are spent to end this phenomenon. And the Global Working Group, this I think is the best collection of resources, reports on SRGBV. So I urge you to go to that if you need information on SRGBV. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. So I think we should just take a few questions for clarifying questions from the room and from online. And I'll ask Nicole to race around with the microphone so we can catch the audio. So let's just take 2 or 3 clarifying questions from the room.
Thanks, Julie, for this presentation and for your marvelous leadership in this very important area. I'm not as familiar with the documents that you mentioned as I could or should be. Oh, sorry, Janae Bulat with RTI International. Sorry about that. So I'm wondering to what extent, and it may not be possible yet, but to what extent are you able to differentiate school-related gender-based violence perpetuated by and upon populations of students, various subgroups of populations of students, such as students with disabilities, students from various subgroups, whether ethnic or religious subgroups?
No, that's a great question. In the original draft of the measurement framework, we did not have a way to differentiate that, but now in the final round of reviews, RTI is going to add in the demographic student characteristics section some questions that will identify children with disabilities. It's using what's called the Washington group set of about four or five questions that have been vetted, that have been used internationally. So I think that will help. I can't remember, I think we certainly asked about the sex of the student. I can't remember the other identifying factors, but definitely in this next draft, we will include the Washington group recommendations. Oh, okay, Jeff.
Thank you. So I had a question. I'm just somebody who feels very strongly about pre-service and making sure that you get to people before they're actually doing the work that they're being trained to do. And is there anything in motion? Is there anything that you are moving towards and figuring out how to get teacher training to incorporate some of this very important stuff so that they are more prepared and so that they sort of work through their own stuff before they're having to address it with the kids?
Yes, the LAR project that I mentioned, it has two main objectives. One is to increase early grade reading scores. The other one is to reduce SRGBV. So to that end, there is pre-service training that when the teachers come in, they receive pre-service training on both early grade reading and how to prevent and respond to SRGBV. And I think in other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, DRC is working on pre-service training. Since I am in the Africa region, I should be more aware of what's going on in other regions. I know that in the Dominican Republic, well, that might have been in-service training. But certainly, as I see a model for addressing SRGBV, a key piece is working with teachers. And a key piece is, and there's also an existing program that was developed under a project called the Safe Schools Program that developed a set of manuals called Doorways. And one of them is a pre-service 25, 30-hour training program for teachers. And in the program, one of the first things it does is asks teachers to think about their own experiences, just how do they view gender-based violence, how do they view their relationship to their students. But it is, I agree with you completely, first you have to have them think about their own experience and how it marked their lives and their lives as teachers. to help them become protectors of children, not predators. Although, as we know, the majority of teachers are not predators, but it's that minority that we need to deal with.
Hi, Jeff Jordan, PRB. Julie, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to see this aspect and this approach. I'm thrilled that AID is playing a role also in the broader task force and looking at the research aspects. Can you speak a little bit to, and this may be a broader issue, the interlinkages between this work and the IGWG? Because I always go back and forth with both being hopeful that we are addressing issues related to gender that impact our work. But here we're doing gender in the context of education. At the IGWG, it's gender in the context of health. And it's always that difficult thing of what's being served and how can we keep interlinking all of these efforts so that we're also serving the issues of gender, not just in service to something else.
Well, I think once this is finalized, we will certainly disseminate it as widely as possible among the education and health. I mean, I'm glad I'm here today because this is bringing health and education together. To be honest, in this work, we've gotten feedback on it from within AID and also from the Global Working Group, but that still is mainly in the field of education. And it was interesting in developing the framework. We did look at things like the Violence Against Children survey, all the global surveys that have to do with violence. And certain questions were taken, but I think like with the VAX, the focus is on sexual violence, which once again, within the health sector, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe it's looking at where the overlaps are, because certainly when it comes to the school environment, then the corporal punishment is a huge factor in eliminating. And so with corporal punishment, it's hard to see how that overlaps, but I think if we're sharing tools and seeing how we can build on things together and stand on the shoulders of each other, then maybe we can see how those things will come closer together. So no, that the conversation will continue, and I'm really glad that I was invited to speak today to, I think, what is probably predominantly a health audience, I would assume, given the hosts.
We had one clarifying question from the audience online, and Julie, the person wanted to know the grades. The slide that you showed about the study correlating bullying in school with academic achievement, what grades were those studies conducted?
That was middle school. So I think it's, fourth, Tim's and Pearls does 4th grade and 8th grade. I believe this is 4th, maybe 5th and 6th. So it's upper primary, lower middle.
Great. Any other clarifying questions? Otherwise, we can move to general discussion. Okay, Julie, why don't you join me up at the front here? And unfortunately, for the people who are online, they won't be able to see us because we'll be sitting with our backs to the camera.
Oh, we need 2 mics now. But if I can start off by building on what Jeff just said, we do want to find partners where we can pilot this instrument at least another time. So I think this might be an area where there could be some overlap in cooperation. So if you're working on projects where it would benefit the project, because also this is, doing a baseline like this with all of its not only cost implications, but the emotional implications on having children undergo these surveys. I mean, this has to be done by serious people. I'll just state the obvious, but I think it should be stated. But if people are working on what might be adolescent reproductive health projects in a school that would benefit from having this kind of information, then I don't see why a partnership in piloting this tool another time would have to be limited to education projects per se. So I think that's maybe an area where we could work together.
And are you looking for a site in Africa?
I'd have to see how primarily, but I don't think if there were a perfect partnership, I guess I would like to see how much the envelope can be pushed.
Thanks, Julie. So I'm going to just kick off the discussion with some questions about methodology for research with children of this age. And so these are questions both for Ravi and for you, Julie. And Julie, you mentioned that doing research with middle school age children is not the same as working with adults. And I noticed that in your survey tools, the module 1 rested on some scenarios. So I wonder if you could just share a little bit about the thinking behind, or the conceptual thinking about framing research methodologies for children of this age group and some lessons learned from testing those tools. And Ravi, I'm going to come to the same question to you next, so prepare.
Okay, well, as I said, the measurement framework was the result of a global literature review. And one of the findings of the literature review was that it was very helpful in speaking with children to first talk about a sensitive issue in a third-person type situation. And so the scenarios, it's a little story. It's a 150-word story that gives an example of, well, this is a girl, Anna, and she was going to school, and it just gives an example of a child having violence perpetrated against her or him. And so it's a way to get into talking about the topic that is the purpose is to put the child at ease and to talk about, because it's always easier to talk about things that happen to somebody else. And so this is a way to sort of step by step in a systematic way start to drill down to talking about a personal experience. So, and it was based on the literature review.
That is so cool. I like that a lot. Do you adapt that scenario or that vignette for the sex or the age of the child who's taking the test?
It's up to the interviewer which scenario he or she will use. So there's a bank of scenarios. They're divided into 2 age groups, younger adolescents, older adolescents, and then they're split in between a bullying, sexual violence, or corporal punishment. So I mean, that was one methodological question that we had, like, oh my goodness, if you're going to leave it to the choice of the interviewer as to which scenario he or she uses, what does that do to comparability and things like that? But at a certain point, that would be just too hard to control and mandate. So it is a bank of scenarios that people can choose from. I think using their own quick judgment as to which scenario would make the most sense with the child that's with them. And also another thing is to make sure that there are social workers on site, that there is a support network, and referrals have been organized so that if any child is in distress as a result of working, as a result of participating, he or she has someone to talk to. And then you also have to make very clear, and this depends on the country, if someone hears about violence that's been perpetrated, in some countries this could very well be a crime. So procedures have to be in place so that the enumerators, the interviewers, everybody on the research team knows what they are supposed to do if they hear about any violence or any crimes that have been perpetrated against children. So,
Thank you. And I'll just turn to Ravi next before we turn to other questions. If you have any comments on research methodologies with this age group.
Well, I think I completely endorse the approach that she just now described. It is a very sensitive, is highly sensitive to address some of these issues with children and make them to respond to some of these issues which are of you know, very sensitive nature, and therefore one has to prepare the school as a system. We have to prepare the support system before we get into extracting some of these issues and answers from the children. What we did was that we preceded the actual data collection by a lot of formative work in these schools that opened up the discussions on these issues. So as a result, in many places, there was role plays and children came in together talking about these issues openly, and you know, it sort of provided an atmosphere and a supporting kind of enabling environment within which we could situate some of the discussions. But yeah, I have nothing more to add than what is said there. Nandita, would you like to say something on it?
Okay, I think this is a question for which maybe there are more questions than answers, frankly. And we struggled a lot with the methodology. And I mean, I do want to say that, you know, a lot of the decisions we took also very contextual. So like in India, you know, children are used to giving paper and pen exams. Interacting with adults and actually giving interviews, unless the adults are very, very skilled and have capacities to really engage children, what we found is that you have a lot of the power and the authority dynamic that starts, you know, kind of playing out when you are trying to do survey interviews with children which are person to person. So actually the decision that we took after kind of trying out a few methods was to do self-administered questionnaires with the children. And you know, if we, even then, when one actually saw children coming to the sections, you could actually see, you know, many of them trying to kind of, you know, hide their, you know, tabs or, you know, the answer sheets that were given to them, the survey sheets. And there is a lot, I mean, I don't know how the experience is in other countries, but apart from the fact that children are not encouraged to speak and reach out to adults to voice a lot of their experiences, they are hushed and ignore the other problems that comes with reporting violence that children face. There is also the whole thing of, if you're going to talk about these things, you're giving the adults and the teachers and your school a bad name. That's a very, very strong cultural context that is there in the schools in India. And I mean, in terms of the methodology, that's one thing that I think we would like to, you know, just have other people's thoughts, experiences on that. For the surveys, we have actually used always self-administered questions, sometimes with the audio because of fragile levels of literacy. And you know, the very interesting methodology of using situational vignettes is something that we've actually used when we've tried to do, you know, more qualitative interviews, in-depth interviews, where we've had a number of sittings with the children. And one part of the decision is also, like I was saying, that in India, you know, social workers trained to deal with children, those capacities are very limited. In a lot of rural areas or semi-urban areas, smaller towns, you actually don't even have people you can often reach out to for some of these issues. So, you know, in terms of ethical issues, I think there's such a lot of things to say, but they very much link with the methodology. And I think it's, you know, this is actually the forum to try and hear what other people's experiences are, whether these are some of the issues that have come up there. You know, it becomes very resource intensive if we are looking for very, very trained people to do these surveys on a regular basis. What can be the other alternatives? What is the preparedness, the ethical issues? So I'm just, I think, maybe putting more issues on the table, but very important.
Thank you for that. It's a little difficult to hear you, so I'm just going to see if I can try to summarize some of the things that you said. And I heard you say that there's a lot of contextual issues to keep in mind while you're designing the kind of research with children in school-based settings, including questions about whether the survey methodologies or tools are pen and paper, individually managed, or done through interviews, verbal interviews. The pushback or the impression from the schools that asking such questions about violence within the school setting might give a stigma to the schools. It's giving the schools a bad name, as well as questions about parental involvement and consent. Those are some of the things that I heard, and I might have missed some things, but thank you so much for sharing that. And I also heard you ask for suggestions or experiences from others in the audience or in the room to share as well, because these are real issues from a research perspective. I'm going to ask for questions in the room, and I'm going to turn to some questions online. Or comments. Do you want to take them all? No. No.
Hi, this is Janae Violette again with RTI. Ravi, this question is for you. And I don't recall the exact slide, but in a couple of slides you showed the change over time from baseline to end line in the treatment group versus the control group. And there were some interesting shifts in the control group scores as well. So we know that asking these types of questions during a baseline assessment can generate thought and perhaps increased awareness of one's own behaviors and one's own experiences. I wonder if you could, if you have any insights into what might have been happening in the control group over the period from baseline to end line over the 2 years.
Fabio Verani, thanks you for asking that question. That was his question also.
Thank you for asking that question, because I think this is something that we have also been discussing in our own team, and I would ask Nandita and Pranita to reflect on the situation of shifts in the control schools. So one thing is definite, that the whatever was asked during the baseline could have some influence on the reporting of some of the attitudes and behavior at the end line, but that we think is normalized because that should be the same across all the schools. So we are assuming that to be spread across both intervention and control schools. And since we are looking at differences scores, then we are attributing it largely to what happened in between rather than just the baseline questions. But we have seen in some of the on some of the parameters, the control school also shifted in the positive direction, and we think that there has been a secular shifts in some of these attitudes and self-reported behavior on violence that's happening in the control schools also. But in this case, we have seen much bigger shifts happening in the intervention schools, in fact, on both attitudinal and behaviors, positive direction and the desirable direction. I don't know if I got your question correctly, but I thought that the influence of just the instrument, that questionnaire that was asked, could be minimal in terms of creating the outcome. Pranita, how do you respond?
Yeah, actually, if you really look at the questions, which actually required students to think, look at the individual statements, there, control arm is very low. But something which is more in terms of yes or no, something which is also children can understand in terms of politically correctness, in terms of perpetration of violence or experience of violence. There we saw that having a questionnaire where you have to answer certain things could actually trigger some of those things, but something which needs much more reflection, which doesn't really come automatically just by survey questionnaire. So, I mean, that two different, like this variation we observe in different type of questions that we ask children to respond on.
Again, we're having just a little bit of difficulty hearing you if you can sit really close to the mic. But I think I heard you talk about the type of questions that are being asked of children and how the type of questions might influence the way they're responding both in the control group and in the intervention group from the baseline. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, you know, the thing is that through document, monitoring, we try to see that if there is any other program happening in the control or comparison schools. We don't, I mean, so far what we gathered is there's no specific program happening, except maybe, but you know, the thing is that children can get exposed to new thinking, new ideas from there, so many other sources as well. And that was the reason why we had, despite doing the randomized, we had the baseline and end line for comparison to do the DID analysis. Yeah, so that's.
I think you're saying that there may be some changes in the environment or some other factors within the environment that might be influencing changes in perceptions or attitudes in both the intervention and the control groups. I wonder if you might also reflect a little bit on the natural progression of thinking and conceptualizing ethical issues in these age groups. I think a 10-year-old conceptualizes ethical issues very differently than a 14-year-old. So when you're tracking kids across time as they developmentally mature, do the kind of answers that you get a little bit later reflect a developmental progression beyond the kind of intervention that you're aiming for? I think this is just a very tough area to track and measure. So I really hand it to the researchers to try to help us figure this out.
Yeah, you know, you're absolutely right, Doris. This is so the final shift that we see is an outcome of many intervening influencers and drivers, but we assume that in this kind of a controlled experimental design, we are accounting for those influences operating in similar ways between control and the intervention arms. So as far as the impact of this particular program is concerned, both between control and experimental arms, some of those drivers will remain similar to these. The unexplained variants that we had seen, we assume that they would be similar. But you are absolutely right. Some of the responses after 2 years of the program, because our age group was 11 to 14, let's say. So the children who were interviewed at the age of 11 and they were later than interviewed when they reached 13, there might have been the influence of the natural progression, and that's what we are saying. That's what we are saying, the secular shifts in their knowledge and attitude because of the exposure to many other influences. And yes, Nandita adds that including even the questionnaire might have also added a bit of the influence, but we assume that would be similar across both the experimental and control areas. That's what we are assuming. And that's why we are confident in attributing the shifts and changes to the intervention wherever we see there is significant difference.
Okay, I'm just going to take a few more questions from the room.
Hi, this is Michal Avni from USAID and the IGWG. I think Julie's presentation really highlighted the wider range of manifestations of gender-based violence in the school settings. And the question that I have for you, Ravi, is to what extent the GEMS program and curriculum explicitly incorporated and addressed bullying and corporal punishment, both in the training of teachers and in the intervention itself with the children, and how that was tied into this concept of gender inequality.
Yeah, of course.
Let me just add on that. This is Charlotte Feldman Jacobs, and thank you both for a lot of thought-provoking presentations. So, Julie, the other question I have for you is, did I hear you say that the data on the impact of bullying by gender disaggregation didn't show any difference in the genders? So that's one point that I want to clarify. But also building on Michal's question for Ravi, so if you're changing gender norms, do you think that what you know now you would want to start earlier in the schools? Thanks.
I'm going to turn to Julie first because that was a really quick question.
As I recall, and the data is there, but I didn't have it in my presentation. Of the 3 countries, I believe it was in Ghana, there was no gender differential, but in the other 2 countries, there were gender differentials, but they were somewhat flipped. And so it depended on the country. But I guess you could broadly say, it is important to look at the gender differences because depending on the setting, you might find them. But I can, as follow-up to this, I can send you
That would be awesome. Yeah.
the actual data versus my big, dim recollection.
All right, we'll turn to Ravi next.
Thank you, Michal, and thank you for asking these questions. I think this issue of, I'm taking the second question first, but you're right. Even we began intervening at the 6th standard, 6th and 7th, and we realized that even at that stage, the children were already ready with their ideas of what it is like to be a boy and what is it like to be a girl, and what they should be pursuing as their ideal self, growing up. So when we went into these schools, they were already sitting separately, they were playing separately. There were some gray areas that we wanted to capitalize, and we did on that. But we definitely think that we should begin even earlier. What we know is that there's a definite case of learning the socialization process that happens even before they reach the standard 6. We see from 1st to 5th standard itself in the primary, there's a lot of notions around boyhood and girlhood begins to shape there, and there were indications of those shaping ideas. So yes, we would definitely like to move to the even earlier age in a continuum. And also, what Nandita adds, that not only stop at the 13, 14 years, but continue later to track what's happening in the later life when they get into the later adolescent and early adulthood stages. So that's one. And Michal, I didn't get, so corporal punishment was kind of taken as one of the issues discussed in the schools with teachers and with the children as one form of violence, because the children after the session on the violence, they clearly recognized corporal punishment as one of the forms of violence, and they started raising that question to the teachers. In fact, in many schools, this was one we really faced this. We were confronted with these questions, and in some places irritation by the teachers when they said that children are asking us not to use punishment as a mode of disciplining, and then it was so gendered because more boys were subjected to the corporal punishment than girls by teachers, and it was kind of a very stereotypical response on the part of teachers to punish boys because they were seen as perpetrating, the indiscipline in the schools and bullying. And whereas, so there was no dialogue, there was no discussion, there was no ways of engaging them in finding out what happens. But as a blanket, as a thumb rule, they were put to some kind of a physical punishment as kind of form of disciplining them. So in most of these schools, we have begun to see the reactions to the corporal punishment from the children.
Yeah, in the teachers' training, it was explicitly discussed, and in fact, that came out even from teachers, their own behavior, And so yeah, behavior, their own discomfort, and that was like another struggle that teachers had, that while conducting sessions around violence, they have to really reflect on their own behavior. So that was like the biggest challenge that they shared during the training itself, and also when they were implementing or taking the sessions. So corporal punishment came very strongly for teachers, and to great extent to students as well. The students were fairly clear about, irrespective of the perpetrators, they knew all the different forms of violence, they knew who all are perpetrators, and there was like a long list that they shared, they discussed, they talked about. I think violence was something all the boys and girls both could associate so well during the classroom session.
And Michal, I can just add that since there is no alternative forms of disciplining that teachers know, they found themselves helpless. This is one point of resistance from teachers in response to the GEMS, because they felt that the tool that they had become questionable, and in a very introspective manner it had become questionable. So we are really thinking that in the next iteration of GEMS in Bihar, we are planning to evolve into the alternative ways of disciplining, or positive disciplining, or bringing in more ways of engaging with children to talk about issues of their behavior, the way they behave. So, is that okay?
Well said. Thank you, Ravi. Okay, I think we have.
I've got a question from.
Yeah, go ahead.
From our participants online. My name is Nicole, by the way. I'm monitoring the question. So it's from the Nepali SAH, and they have a question about early child marriage. So early child marriage is quite common in South Asia, Asian and African countries, and it has severe implication on schooling of children, particularly girls, and so is dowry bride price. Married adolescents, girls and boys often drop out as they are teased by their peers. So some literature shows that early marriage is a component of GBV. Would you clarify on this? This is to Julie and Ravi.
I would see early marriage as a form of gender-based violence, absolutely, and also within the traditional harmful practices. I guess it kind of depends on what your scope of work is or what your manageable interests are. Certainly within AID, we're sometimes constrained as to what we can do with the flavor of funding that we have. So certainly in a basic education funding situation, perhaps there could be messages against early marriage. Although we have found in Malawi under the Safe Schools program, early marriage was not a specific, or ending early marriage was not a specific goal of the program, but just creating a safe space for girls and boys to have someone to talk to. There were, and this is anecdotal, but there were instances in which young girls were told that they were going to get married, that they were being married off, but then they were able to go to the community volunteer and talk and go to the school. And so some marriages were did not happen because there was that space that had been opened through something that wasn't addressing early marriage specifically, explicitly, but it had that impact. So I think I would agree that in theory, early marriage is a type of GBV, and how it's addressed and it can be addressed within a school setting. It probably depends on the type, the constraints you have on your funding, how explicitly or implicitly, or have it be a positive unintended outcome of what you're doing.
Which domain would you put that under, Julie? And where would the indicators fall?
Well, to be honest, since our work deals with basic education and we're constrained by that, at this point in the measurement framework, I don't think early marriage, we are not defining early marriage as a form of school-related gender-based violence. Mm-hmm. So within our specific school-centric framework that is not explicitly in our framework. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
And Ravi, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. We also don't think that the early marriage or child marriage is primarily a school-based gender-based violence. It pervades into the larger cultural context within which the children and girls live. But we definitely think that the denial of rights and denial of their spaces and denial of their aspiration is a form of violence, because that, and if there is some way we could enhance the ability of girls to aspire and then create an agency through which they can articulate that aspiration and assert themselves to realize that aspiration, is something that we would like to achieve through GEMS. So as a result, our intervention within the GEMS schools was really open to many different forms of discrimination that girls experience and face, both within the schools and their ability to raise those questions in the family, including if there's a discussion on their marrying off. So, and as I said, that's one of the constraints that we faced about children was absenteeism. You know, a lot of these girls will drop out of the schools in order to work in the field and for a variety of other caregiving activities, but also in preparation for marriage, anticipated marriages. So one of the ideas was to get those schools, children or daughters, girls back into the school. And that means girls asserting themselves that they want to continue in the schools. We provided that platform, we provided the ability to the teachers and the schools to even raise that issue, and with girls. So in a way, indirectly, we did not frame it as one of the outcomes that we would measure, because that was within time frame we could not. But changing aspiration around the issues of their ability to earn money and do something in life that they want to do, and not sacrifice those aspirations for the reasons of marriage, was something that became part of the discussions and intervention in the school. And we all think that at one cohort we should really track over a period of time to see how many of them truly resisted marriages. And
actually qualitative, some cases actually emerged where, like, girls resisted not only their own marriage but collectively also approached family to stop
and this is an area with very high prevalence of child marriages. In Jharkhand, where we are working, it's an area of high trafficking and high child marriages, and both are very correlated.
And I just wanted to add that in general, increasing girls' access to school, getting girls into school, is seen as a protective factor against early and child marriage. So in any case, increasing girls' access to school is a very, very important issue that addresses a variety of problems.
Great. We have a couple more questions online that I want to get to because they came in a little earlier, and I'm going to just ask them all together. And Ravi, they're mostly for you. And then there are questions about parental involvement and interest, and what were your experiences with parents' involvement. Also, were the teachers effective in the sessions? What would you change about the teacher preparation for that? And there's a third question about how complaint registration and responses were handled. Those are kind of three kind of big questions, and I know we're kind of running low on time here at the end, so I apologize for throwing all of those at you at the very end. But maybe you could just reflect on what you might do differently next time related to parents or teacher preparation or complaint mechanisms. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Pranita, you wanted to.
So, doing more actually, so engagement of parents in community, that's definitely something we would strongly do in the next phase. I mean, we tried even in the current phase, but the process that followed could engage parents to some extent, but since it was linked from school, from school to parents, but in the next phase, we plan to do more community engagement, so that to link both the family and community with the school. So that is definitely one thing we would like to do. Now, in terms of teachers, see, the thing is that GEMS program we always envision as a institutionalization of gender discourse in school system. So, and that is possible only through engagement of teachers and not as an instrument, but more as a critical constituency. So, I mean, with that recognition, we moved into the schools. We do realize that it's not going to be easy and it will require a lot of effort because it's very human process. We started with training of teachers, 10 to 12 days training. Much more is needed, and not only just in-service training, but also pre-service training, bringing the larger change in terms of pedagogy of learning and teaching process. So we are working with this realization. It's a huge, big task, but that is what we strongly feel that is the way to go forward. And hopefully we'll achieve that. I mean, we in the sense the whole institution are able to achieve. I don't remember the third question. Can you repeat that?
How did you handle complaint mechanisms within the school?
So actually that was definitely a strong gap that we recognized quite early on. We did some training for teachers in terms of like, do's and don'ts, because we realized that teachers cannot do case management or even the counseling in that way. And especially in Jharkhand, where this response mechanism is very nascent stage. So that is another area that we have to work on. In Vietnam, there was effort that was done in terms of training of teachers for counseling. But that also, like, by the time the whole effort was put in place, at the end of evaluation, like, 2-year evaluation phase. But that's another area which I just wanted to add that, I think that before you get into it, the more aspects, you have to touch. But for the complaint mechanism, the other thing that is very contextual is that even because our model is to do two levels of actually awareness. One is within the schools where there is, because the parents, the students will approach the teachers first. So like Pranika said, there is at least the basic thing of do and don'ts. But then the second level of response which is needed in terms of, referrals, case management, who can come and talk to the teacher, who are trained into counseling, social work counselors. While there is a network and people that we put in place, but we have found that needs a lot of strengthening. So, anyone working on ICRW, especially in the South Asian countries, schools themselves don't have in-house counselors in most of the government schools. The referral system becomes very critical, and that's actually the area we're trying to strengthen as GEMS progresses to its next phase.
So I'm really hearing you saying it's a big gap in both the mechanisms for complaints as well as the social worker support, and the referral systems also need to be strengthened in the next round. We are running out of time. This has been the most amazing. Oh, one more question.
It's actually a comment.
Okay.
Really quick.
Okay, great. One more comment.
All right. Thank you for letting me have the stage, Charlotte, for just a second. My name is Emily Brown. I work in the gender department at FHI 360. Thank you, Ravi and Julie, for really great presentations. I learned a lot. Julie, I particularly enjoyed the information you gave us on advocacy. I'm going to find that very helpful in my work. Branching off of your comment related around early marriage and funding silos, I also wanted to go back to the gentleman's point from PRB about the connection between SRGBV in education settings and in health, and that we as a development community at the donor, INGO, and civil society level, we have to be finding innovative ways to connect those funding silos, because to create more awareness around violence, to create more empowerment from violence, and to not make sure that health referral systems or that even services at all are available to those children or their parents or others in the community, we're really doing a disservice. So I just wanted to make that comment. I know those of us in this room are aware of that, but we have to keep pushing that at an advocacy level. Thank you.
Bravo. That is exactly a wonderful summary of a plea for more coordination, so thank you so much for saying that. And let's please give a big round of applause to both Ravi and the team in ICRW in India and Julie. Thank you for coming. So wonderful to have you both here, and this is a fabulous opportunity to learn from all of your experiences in the research. Charlotte, did you want to give a last
I just have
word?
one advertisement, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michal for the last word. I wanted to remind everyone there is a flyer in the back on the IGWG plenary, which will be taking place next Wednesday. And please take one of these or email Nicole if you have a question about that. Secondly, we are going to upload the presentations once we get the green light from Julie and from Ravi, so you can find that at igwg.org with all of the presentations from the previous series events. And Michal has a presentation, and thank you.
So before we close today, I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge Doris Bartel, who has been our co-chair for this GBV task force since, I think, 2011. Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, which is incredible. Doris, you have been incredible. I just want to thank you for your vision and your leadership in this task force. I think that in the 5 years that that you've been on board as co-chair, that we've had really just a range of super interesting events, and you were able to create a very engaging platform for really deep conversation about important issues having to do with GBV research and mitigation. And so we are so grateful to everything that you and Lee Stefanik have done also. And we know you are, you will remain a close friend and supporter, and you'll stay engaged in our task force. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And it's been so fun to work with you. And that's that.
Just show for people on the camera this gorgeous flower. Thank you so much, and we'll say bye, and thank you so much for joining us, and good night to all of those of you in Asia.
Yes, thank you, everyone.